81 years old, Barry Gibb finally said the words he had carried in silence for more than 5 decades. The man the world knew as a legend, the last surviving BG, confessed the one secret that had kept him alive when his brothers, his peers, and nearly everything else around him was gone. It wasn't a song. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the fame that once made him a global icon. It was a woman. The woman who had stood by him through every triumph, every loss, every temptation, and every moment when he nearly lost himself. Her name was Linda, and the truth Barry revealed about their love story would change the way millions saw him forever. This is the hidden love story that saved Barry Gibb's life. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Retro Waves, where the music never dies and the stories behind the legends live forever. Barry Gibb's story doesn't begin with stadiums or flashing lights. It begins with hunger. Born in 1946 on the Isle of Man, Barry was the eldest son of Hugh and Barbara Gibb. Life wasn't easy. The family scraped by, moving from place to place, sometimes barely able to feed their children. When the Gibbs moved to Manchester, they lived in a cramped house where poverty pressed in on every wall. Barry remembered the nights when the cold seeped through the cracks, when his father worked odd jobs, and when his mother stretched every coin to keep the family alive. But there was one escape: music. Barry and his brothers, Robin and Maurice, discovered that when they sang together, the world felt lighter. Their voices blended into something magical, a harmony that no amount of poverty could silence. Still, Barry carried something deeper, a fear that he would always lose everything, that if he ever found success, it could vanish in an instant. That fear never left him. When the Gibb family emigrated to Australia in 1958, Barry was just 12 years old. In Redcliffe, the brothers performed at local theaters, desperate to turn their gift into something real. They called themselves the Bee Gees, short for Brothers Gibb. By the time they returned to England in the mid-1960s, they had grown sharper, hungrier, and more determined. Almost overnight, they went from unknowns to chart toppers. Barry was just 20 when the Bee Gees had their first hits in the UK. Suddenly, the boy who once feared losing everything was being told he could have it all. But with that fame came chaos. Robin was moody and ambitious, Maurice leaned toward alcohol, and young Andy, still a child then, would soon follow their path. Barry, as the eldest, became the reluctant leader, and though he smiled for the cameras, inside he was terrified. Fame could disappear, success could collapse, and with it he feared his entire world. It was in the middle of this chaos that fate intervened. In 1967, Barry appeared on Top of the Pops, the BBC show that defined British music television. Backstage, surrounded by lights, models, and the constant hum of fame, Barry noticed her, Linda Gray, a Scottish beauty queen crowned Miss Edinburgh. She wasn't like the others. She didn't swarm around him. She didn't try to dazzle. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence, almost detached from the madness of the scene. Barry would later say he knew instantly. The minute I saw her, I knew she was it. But at the time, he didn't just fall for her beauty. He fell for her calm, for her independence, for the fact that she didn't seem to care that he was a rising star. To Barry, Linda wasn't chasing fame. She was living her own life, on her own terms, and that difference made her unforgettable. For Barry, pursuing Linda was unlike anything he had done before. Women chased him now. They waited outside hotels. They slipped phone numbers into his hand. They screamed his name. But Linda didn't. She wasn't impressed by the spotlight. Barry had to chase her, and chase her he did. Their connection was instant, but their love grew carefully, quietly, away from the glare of cameras. Barry already knew fame could destroy people. He saw it in the musicians around him. Affairs, drugs, alcohol. It seemed almost inevitable. But Linda wasn't a fan, and she wasn't a fling. She was someone he couldn't afford to lose. What Barry didn't say then, but would confess decades later, was that Linda was already saving him from the very temptations that were beginning to swallow his brothers. In 1970, at just 23 years old, Barry married Linda. The Bee Gees were still climbing, still hungry, but Barry didn't want to wait. He didn't want to risk losing her to the chaos that seemed to surround his world. From the outside, it looked like a perfect fairy tale, a pop superstar marrying a stunning beauty queen. But inside, the pressure was already building. Robin and Maurice fought constantly. The band split briefly. Fame was already showing its cracks. But at home, Barry and Linda built something different, something private, something real. While the Bee Gees wrote and recorded, Linda built a sanctuary. She gave Barry a sense of normalcy, something most stars never had. She wasn't interested in interviews or magazine covers or chasing her own fame. She was interested in him, in the man, not the legend. And as Barry would later admit, that difference meant everything. The 1970s weren't all glamour. The Bee Gees stumbled through the early part of the decade, unsure of their direction. Hits were scarce, and critics began to wonder if they had already peaked. Barry, carrying the band's future on his shoulders, struggled with doubt. Could they survive? Could he keep his brothers together? Could he keep from losing it all, the way he had always feared? It was Linda who steadied him. She reminded him that even if the Bee Gees fell apart, even if the charts abandoned him, he wasn't alone. He had her. He had their growing family. He had something no critic could take away. Barry didn't say it out loud then, but inside, he knew the truth. He wasn't just in love, he was being saved. By the mid-1970s, Barry Gibb had become the architect of a sound that was about to conquer the world. The Bee Gees, once dismissed as a fading pop act, reinvented themselves with a falsetto-driven style that would define an entire era. When Saturday Night Fever premiered in 1977, it wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural earthquake. The soundtrack, led by Barry's soaring voice, dominated the charts. Stayin' Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, each became an anthem. For a time, the Bee Gees had more hits on the Billboard Top 10 than the Beatles. Barry was everywhere. His songs weren't just on the radio, they were the radio. His face was on every magazine. His voice was the voice of disco. And with that kind of fame came something darker. The 1970s music world was built on excess. Sex, drugs, and fame destroyed more marriages and lives than anyone could count. Barry, tall, handsome, with his mane of hair and magnetic stage presence, became an international heartthrob. Women threw themselves at him. Parties, offers, and temptations never stopped. Many expected Barry to fall like so many others, to stray, to lose himself in the lifestyle. But he didn't. Decades later, when asked how he managed to avoid the same mistakes that ruined countless rock stars, Barry admitted the truth. Linda. She saved me from myself, he confessed. It wasn't just loyalty, it was survival. Barry knew his own weaknesses. He knew how easy it would be to give in. But Linda's quiet strength, her presence at home, reminded him of what was real. She never sought the spotlight, never chased the lifestyle. She gave him a sanctuary, and that sanctuary became his lifeline. During these years, while the Bee Gees were selling hundreds of millions of records, Barry and Linda were quietly raising their children. Stephen, their eldest, grew up surrounded by music. Ashley, Travis, Michael, and later Alexandra followed. At home, Barry wasn't the falsetto icon of disco. He was a husband, a father, a man reading bedtime stories and strumming guitar in the living room. For Barry, that contrast was everything. Other stars lived only for the stage. Barry lived for the moments after the stage, when Linda reminded him that beyond the screaming fans, there was still life, still love, still normalcy. But fame is never permanent. By the early 1980s, the disco backlash hit with a fury no one could have predicted. Radio stations began banning Bee Gees songs. Disco sucks became a rallying cry. Once celebrated as kings, the Bee Gees were suddenly mocked, ridiculed, and pushed aside. Barry, who had always feared losing everything, was crushed. After years of being adored, he found himself vilified. His identity, built on music and success, was suddenly under attack. Robin grew bitter, Maurice struggled with alcohol, and the family faced humiliation on a global scale. For Barry, it felt like déjà vu. That same old fear of losing it all had come back to life. But once again, Linda kept him grounded. She reminded him that critics didn't define him. She reminded him that while the world might turn its back, his family never would. It was a lesson Barry carried silently, one he wouldn't fully admit until decades later. He didn't survive that storm on his own. He survived because Linda refused to let him sink. In 1988, tragedy struck when Andy Gibb, the youngest brother, died suddenly at just 30 years old. Though Andy had tasted fame on his own, he had been plagued by addiction and fragile health. His death wasn't just a loss to music, It was a personal devastation for Barry. Andy wasn't just a brother, he was almost like a son. Barry had tried to guide him, to protect him, but nothing could save Andy in the end. The grief was overwhelming. Barry admitted later that Andy's death nearly destroyed him. For months, he carried the guilt, the anger, the sense of helplessness. Many wondered if the Bee Gees would ever recover, but Linda wouldn't let Barry spiral. She reminded him that grief could either bury him or give him a reason to hold tighter to the ones he still had. Her presence became even more vital. Barry began to see more clearly what he had long felt, that without her, the weight of fame and loss would have crushed him completely. In the 1990s, the Bee Gees experienced a resurgence. Nostalgia brought their music back into the spotlight, and they were recognized as true legends. But by then, Barry was no longer the unstoppable frontman. His health had begun to fail. Years of performing left him with crippling arthritis and severe back pain. At times, he could barely play guitar. The very music that had carried him through life was now physically punishing him. Fans didn't know the extent of his suffering, but Linda did. She saw the nights when he couldn't sleep, the mornings when he could barely move, the silent battles he fought to keep going, and once again, she became his strength. She reminded him that even if his body weakened, his legacy was already secure, that his music had changed the world, but his love, their love, was what truly defined his life. Through all these years, the triumphs, the backlash, the tragedies, Barry rarely spoke of Linda publicly. He thanked her, yes, but he never revealed the depth of what she meant. That was his secret, that while the world saw him as the brilliant songwriter, the last Bee Gee, the icon of disco, the real reason he survived when so many didn't, was Linda. It was a truth he wouldn't say out loud until decades later, until he was 81 years old. In 2003, the Gibb family faced a tragedy that would forever change Barry's life. Maurice, the easygoing twin, the peacekeeper who smoothed over arguments and carried light into every room, died suddenly from complications after surgery. He was just 53. Barry was shattered. Maurice wasn't just a brother, he was the glue that held the Bee Gees together. Barry had always leaned on him, not just musically, but emotionally. Without Maurice, the bond between Barry and Robin unraveled. The brothers, once inseparable on stage, drifted apart in silence and bitterness. Barry sank into grief. For months he couldn't touch a guitar, couldn't listen to the songs that had once been his lifeblood. Every lyric, every melody reminded him of the brother he'd lost. And it was here, in the darkest hours, that Linda became more than a wife. She became his shield. She protected him from the outside world, from the press, from the crushing demands of fans who wanted him to keep performing. She gave him space to break down, to rage, to grieve. But she also refused to let him give up completely. 9 years later, in 2012, tragedy struck again. Robin, Barry's twin in harmony if not in birth, lost his battle with cancer. The bond between Barry and Robin had always been complicated, full of rivalry, full of clashes, but also full of magic. Together, their voices had created the sound of the Bee Gees. When Robin died, Barry was left utterly alone as the last surviving Bee Gee. The phrase "the last man standing" haunted him. Fans thought it was a badge of honor, but for Barry, it was a curse. "I didn't want to go on," he admitted. He couldn't bear to perform the old songs. He couldn't even listen to them. To him, they weren't just music, they were ghosts. Every note carried the voices of Andy, Maurice, and Robin. Every harmony was a reminder that he was harmonizing with silence. Barry confessed that during those years, he lived in isolation. He considered disappearing from music forever, but Linda refused to let him vanish. She reminded him of their children, their grandchildren. She reminded him that while he had lost his brothers, he still had a family that needed him. Imagine surviving all your brothers. Imagine carrying not just your own grief, but the legacy of an entire generation of music. That was Barry's burden. He stood on stage at tribute concerts, his voice trembling, sometimes unable to finish songs. Fans thought it was emotion, but in truth, it was agony. He admitted later that he wasn't sure he deserved to still be alive when his brothers weren't. Survivor's guilt became his shadow. Yet again, Linda became the one who pulled him back. She told him he wasn't meant to replace his brothers, he was meant to remember them. She told him that the Bee Gees' story wasn't finished as long as he was still here. Her words didn't erase the grief, but they gave him permission to keep going. As if grief weren't enough, Barry's body began to betray him. Severe arthritis left his hands stiff and painful. Back problems made it hard to stand for long performances. At times, he wondered if he would ever play guitar again. Fans saw the smiling legend, the polished interviews, but Linda saw the pain, the sleepless nights, the mornings when he couldn't move, the despair of a man who had given his life to music, only to feel his body rebel against it. Barry admitted years later that Linda's care kept him alive. She wasn't just emotional support, she was practical, protective, refusing to let him push himself to collapse. And once again she reminded him, he wasn't just a singer, he was a husband, a father, a grandfather. He was still needed. Through all of this, the fame, the fortune, the tragedies, Barry kept one truth hidden. He rarely spoke of it publicly. He thanked Linda, yes, but he never told the full story of what she truly meant. Sitting in interviews, his voice fragile, his eyes carrying decades of memories, Barry spoke the words he had held back for half a century. Linda saved my life. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here. It wasn't a dramatic exaggeration, it was the truth. Without Linda, he believed, he would have gone the same way as Andy, lost to addiction, the same way as Maurice, undone by his own fragility, the same way as Robin, consumed by illness and silence. Fame would have destroyed him, grief would have crushed him, his body would have failed him, but Linda, steady, strong, silent, held him together. Today, Barry Gibb is remembered as the last surviving BG, the man who gave the world some of the most iconic songs in history, the man whose falsetto defined disco, the man who carried a family legacy on his shoulders. But behind that story is another story, the story of a love that endured through poverty, through temptation, through backlash, through unimaginable loss. The story of Linda, the woman who stood by him when the world screamed his name and when the world turned its back, the woman who raised his children while he carried the weight of fame, the woman who reminded him over and over that he was more than his music. Barry's greatest hit wasn't recorded in a studio, it wasn't sold on vinyl, it wasn't played on stage. His greatest hit was a love story, one he lived quietly, every day, with the woman who saved him. Barry Gibb finally let the world know the truth, that the secret behind his survival, the reason he could endure when everyone else was gone, was Linda. His brothers gave him music, but Linda gave him life, and in the end, that love story may be the greatest legacy of all. This was the untold story of Barry and Linda Gibb, a love that carried him through fame, tragedy, and survival. If you want more hidden truths behind the legends you thought you knew, make sure to subscribe to Retro Waves, where the music never dies and the stories live forever.